Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for turning up to see and listen to my little display. As Chris has said, we're sharing this between us. I'm doing Philately, and Chris is doing Postal History of World War II. And this presentation that I've got here is on the 1 franc 50 Pétain issue of 1942, portraying Philippe Pétain, Marshal of France, an honour bestowed upon him in 1918 after he had led the French army to victory at Verdun. It was one in a series of definitive stamps issued between 1941 and 1942. And for me, the printings of the 1 franc 50 Pétain epitomise philately in World War II. And here in front of you, we've got really the creation of the stamp then, because there's no doubt that the portrait of Pétain on the stamp was based on the photograph taken for the Secours National postcards shown on the left. The postcards were printed by Desfossés of Paris, but we don't know who the photographer was. And they were sold predominantly by school children in December 1940, as seen in the photograph below it. And you can see that young girl clutching the set of cards, and the relevant one is on the right-hand side of the bunch that she's holding. Now, next to that postcard, we've got Pierre Gondin's design, which is definitely inspired by the photograph. In fact, it looks like a direct copy of it. But the PTT decided to reject it. The artwork eventually selected for the issued stamp is the next one, which was designed by Jean-Eugène Berthier and subsequently engraved by Jules Piel. It was produced, Berthier produced his work in gouache and Indian ink, and is the only stamp that Berthier ever designed. And finally, on the right, we see a die proof based on the original artwork, and the names of Berthier and Piel have been added to the foot of the design. Now, at this point, I ought to add that all the material in this presentation is from my own collection, unless it's got a copyright underneath, which is usually referring to items that I've seen or scanned at the Musée de la Poste. Here we see some of the artist proofs. On the left are two artist proofs pulled on coloured paper and signed by the engraver Jules Piel. These would have been pulled by the engraver in his own studio. In contrast to Berthier's single output, Jules Piel engraved more than 150 French stamps between 1933 and 1966. And on the right is a die proof pulled in the State Printing Works in the Boulevard Brune in Paris. We now see a dazzling array of colour proofs held at the Musée de la Poste in Paris. On the left is a complete proof with the registration punch at the top, and at the bottom the ink number 519 penciled in the bottom right-hand corner. The other images, the bulk of the other images, are simply cropped images from the proofs held in the museum. The adopted ink for the 1 franc 50 Pétain was number 729, and the colour proof of this was attached to the Bonatire, which I'll be discussing in the next slide. A duplicate of that ink shade, of that colour proof, was then pulled and overprinted duplicata and retained to the archives with the rejected colour proofs. Here we see the Bonatire. The Bonatire is on the left, and it is the document which authorizes the printing of a stamp, and print here authorizes the printing of the 1 franc 50 in its designated color, which was brown. It comprises the aforementioned colour proof, which has been glued to a sheet of paper with the steel of the state printing works. On the right-hand side is an extract from the bon à tirer, which gives you the information as follows. Firstly, the date of authorization of the printing, the 19th of January 1942, the value of the stamp, which represented at the time the internal letter rate. Underneath that, there's a signature, but I've not been able to identify it. It may be that of a junior minister in Paris, as Jean Berthelot, who was the minister of the PTT at the time, was in Vichy with Pétain and the rest of the cabinet. And then in the bottom right-hand corner of the enlargement there is the cachet of the Musée de la Poste and the figure 729 in pencil, which I've said before is the ink number. And then the initials RC and JFB are the initials of the two philatelic experts, Roger Calve and Jean-François Brun, who authenticated, beg your pardon, authenticated all the documents held in the archives. The stamps were printed off the Chambon rotary presses, and which printed with each revolution 2 sheets of 100 stamps. And this slide here illustrates the enormous wide range of inks and papers used due to the erratic supply of suitable printing materials during the war. At the top, from left to right, we see the first day of printing on the 28th of January 1942, and next to it is a printing signed by the engraver Jules Piel. The third has got no historic importance whatsoever or philatelic importance. I simply bought it because it was printed on my birthday. I was born on the 20th of March 1942, and it's nice to look something which is as old as I am. And next to it on the right-hand side is a printing in rather milky brown. It doesn't really, unfortunately, come out as well on the screen as it does in real life, but it's a lovely milky brown ink, and it's printed on thick paper. And in the bottom row, the first block is in sort of chocolate brown on very high quality white paper, which was scarce to encounter during World War II, whereas in sharp contrast, its neighbour is printed on paper which resembles the low-grade GC papers of World War I. The penultimate block is printed in bright red brown ink, and I'll be discussing this in the next slide. And the last block is the last day of printing, the 8th of June 1944, just 2 days after the D-Day landings. Now this is the feuille témoin, or the imprimatur, as we might call it in English, which is a sheet extracted from one of the early printings and on which is recorded the stamp's registration number, the date of registration, the date of withdrawal, and the ink number. Now, if a decision is made to print the stamp in a different color or in a new format, like a booklet, for example, a second feuille témoin will be created to record the change. But in the case of the 1 franc 50 Pétain, we have the highly unusual situation of a second feuille témoin being created for simply a new shade. If you look at the enlargements, we'll see that the original feuille témoin on the left was recorded on the 14th of February 1942, whereas on the right, the printing date of the second feuille témoin is the 12th of May 1944, and its registration date is the 16th of May 1944. And these dates correspond to the appearance of that bright red brown printing shown on the previous slide, and which dominated the final period of the Pétain stamps. Here we see an Armistice Day printing. the 11th of November 1943. Normally, Armistice Day had been a public holiday in France, but ceased to be so during the German occupation. Only a few presses operated on that day with a skeleton staff. This printing is of cylinder CKCL on press 7 on its very last day of operation. And on the right is the use of this armistice printing 1 year later on a registered cover. We now turn to look at what we might call black printings. On the left is a printing in black on thick cream paper to create coussinets d'impression or underlays, part of the make-ready procedure. And the block of 4 in the center shows how these underlays are cut out. They are used to dress the support cylinder to optimize the correct distribution of pressure on the ink cylinder and thereby attaining a more uniform printing. And on the right is a test printing on pink paper to check retouches made to the electrodes. And in the margin, it is signed by the engineer on the 7th of January 1943. Right, we look now at some imperforate issues or printings, including printer's waste, basically. In the top left-hand corner is a block of imperforate stamps cut from the official imperf printing on high-quality white paper. 20 sheets were printed on the 2nd of February 1942 for distribution to officials and associates, although much of it finds its way these days onto the philatelic market. On the top right is a block printed on thick paper with yellow gum. This is the block of 8 that you can see. The printing was discarded on discovering that the 2 abutting electrodes on the printing cylinder were not perfectly aligned, and this is illustrated by the arrows in the enlargement. The bottom pane, which shows the bottom 2 rows of a sheet, is printed on thin paper with yellow gum, but this was discarded due to inconsistencies in the inking. Again, if you look at the enlargement on the left, you'll show the ink. It shows the ink deficiency in the foliage at the top of the stamp, creating a rather bleached appearance. And now we have some examples of what is known as impression recto verso. And to explain this, then, when a sheet tears during the printing process, ink is transferred onto the support cylinder from where it is picked up on the back of the paper when printing resumes. The result is a reverse image of the portrait, as seen in the perforated pair on the left and in an imperforate block on the right. And now let's look at a couple of press malfunctions. On the left is quite a spectacular press malfunction where a strip of paper has attached itself to the cylinder during the printing process and has prevented the transfer of ink. It is remarkable that both the sheet and offending parasite have survived and remain together to this day. And on the right of the screen, we see a malfunction on press 5. The perforation process has staggered to a halt, producing the gradual deterioration of the perforation from full at the bottom through partial and finally to complete imperf at the top. Now here we see something which is known as an impression sur accord, where the printing has continued over a paper join. The paper join could have been the result of paper tearing during the printing process, or the need to join a new reel to the end of the previous reel. The two pink paper sonnets either side of the sheet have been attached by the press technician to alert the checker where the join is, so that the sheet can be withdrawn and destroyed. The two sonnets, as well as the join itself, have been inked over by the design. The join perhaps can be better appreciated by looking at the gummed side of the sheet, where you can see a block of 9 at the bottom left-hand corner. The 1 franc 50 Pétain was the only booklet printed during the war. We see at the top is an example of a booklet with marginal bars, printing of which started on the 1st of April 1942. And the booklet you see here is from this first day of printing. From July 1942, booklets were printed with marginal advertising, promoting the activities and achievements of the Secours National. Initially created during World War I, the Secours National was a charity relaunched by Marshal Pétain in 1940, its principal role being to support French prisoners of war and their families. The third booklet is an example of a double publicité, where a misaligned cut has included at the top publicity from the neighbouring booklet. It's also worth pointing out that the difference of shades encountered in the sheet printing are likewise encountered in the booklet printings. Following an act passed on the 6th of December 1942, ministerial departments within the Vichy government were to lose their postal franchise and be issued with courrier officiel stamps, the cost of which would be deducted from their budgets. The adopted design was printed in the same colour as the 1 franc 50 Pétain issue. Recorded, oh, beg your pardon, I've forgotten to mention the proof on the left. Yeah, the proof on the left is of the initial design by Charles Mazelin, and is signed by the engraver Jules Pierre, who also engraved the 1 franc 50 Pétain, of course. Charles Mazelin's design underwent several modifications, and on the 27th of February 1942, it was authorized for printing. Now, as I said before, the adopted design was printed in the same color as the 1 franc 50 Pétain, and recorded printing dates are the 24th of April, of which there is an example top right, and on the 26th of May 1942. And the stamp was scheduled to be issued on the 1st of July 1942. However, as a result of continuous and successive objections and appeals from the ministers and secretaries of state, the date of issue was postponed. When in the summer of 1944, de Gaulle's provisional government succeeded the French state, instructions were given for the stamps to be destroyed and for the paper to be recycled at Aubervilliers. As part of the recycling process, the stamps were immersed in water to remove the gum, but after drying, some sheets were misappropriated by the employees. We see here to the right a block of the 1 franc 50 Francisque without gum that was salvaged during the recycling process. And it shows the effect of water saturation. Not only has the gum been removed, hence revealing the white paper, but the red pigment has leached through the paper. In the early 1960s, a quantity of Francis stamps was discovered amongst government stock, which had not been dispatched for recycling. These stamps have retained their gum and their original fresh colour, of which an example is shown here at the bottom. And if you look in the Hiver catalogue and similar catalogues at the listing of these stamps, you will see that they're in 2 columns, but not listed mint and used, but listed mint with gum and without gum. Now, one means of raising funds for the Secours National was adding surcharges to stamps. In this case, 50 centimes on the 1 franc 50 Pétain issue. A wide variety of settings, fonts and ink colours for the surcharge as well as for the stamp were prepared for consideration. The two complete proofs on the left are from my collection, but the remaining extracts are once again from the Musée de la Poste archives. On the proofs, the ink colours are written in pencil, and you'll see there are two numbers. The top number represents the colour of the stamp, and the bottom number is the colour of the ink for the overprint. And here we see the stages leading to the final issue of the Secours National overprinted stamp. On the left is the bon à tirer, dated the 31st of July 1942, but it's not the normal bon à tirer. The enlargement of the stamp shown bottom left, if you look at the bottom left enlargement, reveals that the letters SN are bigger than the surcharge. And the proof of this was stuck to the bon à tirer. When the mistake was discovered, a blue cross was drawn in the bottom right-hand corner of the colour proof on the bon à tirer, indicating an error had been made. The correct colour proof was found with all the elements of the surcharge uniform in size, and this was added to the bon à tirer at the top, and the top enlargement illustrates this. So you've got at the bottom the wrong proof, at the top one is the correct proof with the uniform printing. On the right we have a trial printing of the chosen surcharge in black on pink paper, and below we have printings both perf and imperf of the stamp in blue. This slide shows the sequence of printings. At the top, from left to right, first of all we have a test printing on the 10th of August from cylinder VW, using the normal brown ink for the stamp and black for the surcharge, together with a single copy of the stamp. And I'm going to emphasize that the single copy of the stamp is mine. The one on the left belongs to one of the biggest collectors of Pétain stamps, a gentleman called Max de Rouen. And that is the only dated corner block I have seen, but it is so important because of the date that is on it, the 10th of, get this right again, beg your pardon. Yes, the 10th of August, 1942. This stamp, brown with the black overprint on, is invariably catalogued or listed in auctions as an unissued stamp. This is incorrect. This combination of ink colours was never considered for issue. It is definitely just a test printing and a very sought after item. Top right is a pane from the first day of printing of the issued stamp in blue and carmine, dated the 12th of August 1942. And on the bottom row is an imperforate printing from the 14th of August, and next to it is the final printing of the stamp on the 26th of August. After that, the cylinder VW reverted to printing the regular stamp in brown, which is the last dated corner block you see on the right-hand side. And all these dated corner blocks come from electrode W of plate VW with the one dot at the bottom. So you can see that continuation and match it with the extract from Devanc's book. Now a look at forgeries and propaganda issues. And we have examples here known respectively as the faux de Londres, the faux de Marseille, the faux de Nice, and the faux de Paris. The faux de Londres is a sheet of British intelligence forgeries produced by the Special Operations Executive for agents undertaking missions in France. Elic Howe, a master forger, was charged with producing the forgeries, and the printing was undertaken by Waterloo and Sons. 10,000 forgeries were printed in sheets of 20 on high-quality paper and delivered to Section F of the SOE on the 21st of October 1942. Looking at the bottom left corner, in July and August 1943, during a series of clandestine raids on post offices in Marseille, sheets of the 1 franc 50 Pétain were seized by the Marseille resistance group. The blank gutter margin of each sheet was then printed locally with a General de Gaulle propaganda vignette. The design was based on Berthier's stamp, in which Pétain's portrait was replaced by that of de Gaulle, and the legend Poste Française was replaced by République Française. Meanwhile, in Nice, centre bottom, again imitating Berthier's Pétain design, vignettes bearing the portrait of General de Gaulle and with the RF monogram were printed in sheets of 9 and used in 1943 by the local resistance group for propaganda purposes and on threat mail. In Paris, forgeries of the 1 franc 50 in sheets of 96 were printed in January 1944 by the FFI, les Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, and these are the so-called Faux de Paris. And we'll look at this particular issue in detail on the next slide. To create the FFI Paris forgery, a block of 4 genuine stamps was photographed and etched onto a sensitized zinc plate, which in turn was duplicated the requisite number of times to produce 4 plates of 24 clichés to print a complete sheet of 96. One of these 4 plates is shown top left of the screen. And I can report that I in fact was instrumental in discovering this plate during a visit to the archives of the Musée de la Poste in November 2008. While conducting research there on the Pétain issue, I was brought a few items by the assistant curator, who sought my opinion on them. They were in an incorrectly labelled box that clearly had not seen daylight for decades, and I unearthed at the bottom the printing plate that you see here. You can see quite clearly on the enlargement between each cliché the etched perforation of the original stamps that had been photographed onto the plate, but subsequently filed down, but not completely excised. In the enlargement at the bottom, you can just about see the diagonal cross cuts from corner to corner, perhaps most clear in the center of the image, which were done at the time when the plates were handed over to the authorities at the end of the war. On the right are examples of the so-called color trials, essential in the attempts by the FFI to replicate as closely as possible the shade of the genuine stamp. And now we come on to liberation issues. As towns were progressively liberated by the Allies, local printers were commissioned to overprint the Pétain issues in stock with patriotic logos such as the initials RF of the Cross of Lorraine. Over 160 towns and villages participated, of which only a small representation can be shown here. On the left is the proof sheet of the RF surcharge applied to stamps in Lyon. On the right is a dated corner block of the Lyon overprint and an example of its use on cover. The large Lyon printing was sufficient to meet the postal needs of the huge Rhône-Alpes region, incorporating the départements of Ain, Ardèche, Drôme, Isère, Loire, Rhône, Savoie and Haute-Savoie for 2 whole months. This cover is from Annecy in Haute-Savoie, 145 kilometers from Lyon. Top left is shown one of the 3 different Bordeaux overprints. Most philatelic sources quote the 8th of June as the last day of printing of the 1 franc 50 Pétain, which is true for the unoverprinted issues, and which we saw much earlier in the display. But a 9th of June printing is known amongst the stamps overprinted in Bordeaux, and this is a rare example of it. Below bottom left is the overprint applied at Pont in the département of Charente-Maritime. Note that the stamps bottom left and bottom right of the pane are in italics. The Lille overprint, top right, is an example of an inverted printing, and bottom right, there is an example of the Cherbourg overprint, but which has been omitted on the center stamp. One has to be very careful with these issues, as forgeries do exist, and you will see that these have each been expertised by the likes of Pierre Meyer and received the expert signature on the reverse. All these liberation overprints on this and the previous page are deemed authorised, as they were approved by a person in authority and sold without restrictions to the public over the post office counter. The following overprints were deemed unauthorised, as the procedure mentioned earlier had not been fully implemented. For example, stamps overprinted upon the instruction of the president of the local philatelic society and made available only to members were condemned as unauthorised issues. However, even these, if found used correctly on cover, are very desirable. On the left of the screen is the original and sole copy of the decree signed by Louis Trouillard, Mayor of Montreuil-Bellay, authorising the overprinting of the 1 franc 50 Pétain. The item is dated the 2nd of September 1944, the day after the liberation of Montreuil-Bellay. The text also gives details of the provisional postal service to be operated by the local maquis, announces that the stamps will be put on sale not in the post office, but at the local dairy in honour of its owner, resistance hero and former mayor Gaston Ami, who died while in a German prisoner of war camp. Despite the mayoral cachets, the incorrect sales procedure was later deemed by the PTT as invalidating the issue. It is therefore classified as unauthorised. Note that the stamp on the document is overprinted in the violet mayoral ink, as can be seen bottom right. However, the stamps on sale to the public, top right, were overprinted in blue ink and went on sale from the 12th of September. Top left, the block of 9 was issued as part of a set of 6 stamps, overprinted to commemorate the liberation of Nice on the 28th of August 1944, and sold for 50 francs in aid of the Front National des Alpes-Maritimes. The stamps were also overprinted on the gummed side with the Nice coat of arms. In fact, these stamps were not sold as stamps at all, because by the time they were sold, the stamp had been demonetized. So basically, they were just souvenir vignettes. Top right is the overprint applied by the postmaster, a certain Monsieur Bouet, in the village of Corzay near Poitiers. Unable to find a local printer, he carved the initials RF on the end of a broom handle and applied each overprint manually. 600 stamps were overprinted, that's 600 copies of the 1 franc 50, which was enough for about 4 copies per person in his little community. Bottom left, we see one of the most bizarre liberation issues. It was put on sale in Namur, in the département of Isère. Immediately after the liberation of the town by American troops, the mayor of Namur, Monsieur Victor Millard, and you may have met his name before because he designed first aid covers and postal stationery. He proceeded to create a unique commemorative and patriotic issue. Instead of employing a printer to overprint the stamps, he created copies of an 1874 monarchist vignette from which he attracted and pasted the circular mask over Pétain's portrait. Alongside is the proof of the original 1874 monarchist vignette on which the Namur mask was based. And perhaps the most well-known liberation stamp is that of the Paris FFI, bottom right, which was affixed to souvenir covers alongside a vignette depicting de Gaulle and was put on sale to celebrate the liberation of Paris and to raise funds for the FFI. These are very common. Mint copies, though, of which one is shown here, are extremely scarce, but more so are copies used on non-philatelic mail. The cover shown here was purchased on Delcamp for a few euros, but has since received an expert certificate from the RPSL. And last but not least, we have a couple of items here, beginning with the first day of issue of the 1 franc 50, which was on the 14th of February 1942. However, I've yet to find an example of a cover cancelled on that date. On the left is a cover clearly dated the 1st of February 1942, i.e. 2 weeks before the official date of issue. But any excitement is short-lived when the contents are examined and the date is in fact 1 year later. It is clearly a case of an incorrect year slip. From the 1st of November 1944, all Pétain stamps were demonetized, even if they had liberation overprints. The last day of use was therefore the 31st of October 1944, as shown here top right, on a cover with the Lyon Liberation overprint. And after that date, all mail frank with a Pétain issue was refused, struck with an instruction mark, such as stamp invalid, return to sender, as shown bottom right. Thank you very much. That is the end of my display. Over to you then, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mick. It was a very, very thorough.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, all right. The French really began to mobilise seriously after the Sudeten crisis. A lot of mobilisation, particularly in the Middle East, in the Levant, in Europe, of course. And all those mobilised were entitled to the franchise, but if they wanted airmail, they had to pay the airmail supplement on top of themselves, whereas the basic postage went free of charge. So just an example there probably to Lebanon. The French introduced censorship on the 27th of August, about a week before war was declared. And this was posted on the 28th of August to Germany, but obviously hasn't got through. By that time, the French had stopped all mail going to France, to Germany. It's been returned to Paris, where it was sent from, but the sender has actually by that time left for the west of France after the armistice, or after the outbreak of war, rather. The first winter of the war is always known in this country as the Phony War. And although not a lot did go on, there was some fighting, and these are just postcards from German prisoners of war picked up by the Secretary Postal in France and sent back to Germany through the auspices of the Red Cross. And you've got Paris Centralisateur there, the route by which they went back free of charge to their families. The prisoners of war, there was a special office opened in Paris, Prisonniers de Guerre, that is to the Red Cross in Marseille. Actually, it's been underpaid, but they've allowed it to go free of charge. They haven't charge any postage due. The French seriously introduced censorship in the spring of 1940. And I don't quite know really why they did it on inland mail, but it was used on inland mail. This is Paris to the Courriers in May 1940. And it was done by military region, as I've explained there, Region 12, Toul, and the office was, the office was Toul in Region 12. A lot of the people were interned, of course. This country, France, anybody regarded as an enemy alien would be rounded up, if you like. This particular one, he went into the camp in Vernet, which is down near the Pyrenees, and that was a camp that had been used for Spanish soldiers, Spanish Republican soldiers at the end of the Spanish Civil War, but they were now moved out and used for internees. And this one has gone through again to the Red Cross, free of charge. Another letter to North Africa, but again with the air supplement being paid by the sender. The armistice with Germany was on the 22nd of June 1940. That is 3 days later, where the gentleman has, whether he actually left Balfour or not, one doesn't know, but whatever happened, the letter couldn't be delivered to him, which isn't surprising at the time. As soon as the armistice went into effect, for a short time in Paris, the Germans actually closed all the post offices. When they reopened, no mail could be sent to foreign countries. That was been addressed to Madrid, although it was neutral, it's been refused. France, of course, was divided into two zones after the armistice. And those from the occupied area to the unoccupied area were simply refused. They couldn't be sent on. I think in most cases they were returned to the sender. This one went back a few days, about 3 weeks after it was posted, but the post office hadn't got the means to keep all these. They couldn't do anything with them, so they simply sent them back. And you get a host of letters throughout the summer of 1940, which couldn't be delivered and were returned to sender. There's a little map showing the zones. The occupied zone was the north of France and the Atlantic coast all the way down to the Pyrenees. And the free zone, inverted commas, was based on Vichy with its capital, much more rural areas. And people kept trying to send letters, but they didn't get through. All sorts of little annotations apply to them. Inadmissible, can't be sent on. By September, one would have thought that it had begun to get the message, but they still kept trying, still failed. There's the bank, Societe Generale. That's in early August, but one would have thought by then they might have understood that they couldn't send material, but there we are. One coming in. This one, rather light, I showed it recently in London. The post office responsible for this chateau was the Chateau de Bolon. But Bolon was in the occupied zone. The demarcation line was drawn between the post office and the chateau, so the chateau could no longer get its mail delivered. And as they've noted here, if you look at the bottom right on the reverse of the envelope, the chateau is now actually in the free zone, and the post office in the occupied zones couldn't send any mail to it anymore, had to go back. Rather sad. I don't know how they got their mail, but there we are. That's one to Haut-Rhin, which was actually Alsace-Lorraine, of course, was annexed by the Germans. Um, but at this stage, it really was regarded as a part of Germany, and it's a foreign country. So again, mail was still suspended. But if we look at the next cover, um, it's still suspended. Again, it's going to what is now part of Germany because the Germans have taken it over. But they have notified the conditions for sending mail to these areas have been modified because this is December 1940, and by that time foreign mail had resumed, which we'll see from the next cover. Mail to foreign countries, that is, countries occupied by the Axis and neutral countries, resumed on the 6th of November 1940. But anything that was in the pipeline, and the post office must have been hanging on to some of these letters, foreign letters that is, but anything in the pipeline posted before the 6th of November had to be returned. They wouldn't send it on. Now, why that was, I don't know. It seems rather curious, but there we are. So anything posted after the 6th of November to foreign countries could go as normal, but anything in the pipeline is refused. And just to illustrate that parts of France have been occupied, this is a letter or a postcard actually to Menton in the southeast of France. But of course, Italy also occupied part of southeast France after the armistice. They didn't actually fight with the French, they just piggybacked on what the Germans have been doing. But that postcard has had to go as a foreign postcard via Germany, via Italy, to what had once been part of France. The need to correspond between the two zones became more and more urgent, really. In September 1940, first these interzonal cards were introduced for personal use. Then in October 1940, they introduced these for commercial use. These had to be said, the commercial ones had to go by the Chambers of Commerce. And if you look at the front of it there, this has started out in Marseille, gone to Lyon, and then eventually it's been sent on via Paris, which is the postcard hasn't actually been cancelled until it's reached Paris. And then it's gone on to Rochefort and the Charente-en-Ferrière. They were very strict with these postcards. They were a bit like prisoner of war postcards. You had little boxes which you could fill in. And this one's a rather sad one. It's been written on the 25th, it's been written on Christmas Day, 1940. And they've just written too much. And it's simply been refused and sent back. Very sad. If you read parts of it, you can see it there. Sad Christmas, very cold. But there we are. It's too much written on it. They tried to squeeze too much in and they wouldn't have it. All this control was done by the French post office, but the Germans gave them very strict instructions. They were very careful about what they did to avoid running into trouble with the French. And these cards could be sent to any part of the French Empire that was still controlled by Vichy. And this one's been sent to the French Levant in May 1941. It's been censored by the Germans. But by the time it got to Lebanon, probably, the British and the Free French had ousted the Vichy French. But the Free French, quite generously, really sent it on to whoever it belonged to. So it got it through. So it's censored by the Germans and by the Free French. Nothing could be added to these postcards. The Germans were paranoid about things being stuck under the stamps. The rate went up very drastically in January 1942. It went up 50% actually due to the dire state of the French economy. And this attempt to operate an 80-cent postcard with 2 centimes to make it the right rate, again, has just been refused. You couldn't do that. Wasn't allowed. After the armistice, there were some French warships in Alexandria harbour alongside the Royal Navy, and they were interned by the British. But their crews, skeleton crews, were issued with these postcards. But again, when the brake went up in January 1942, they couldn't operate their postcards. But this time, the French post office in Paris, quite generously, really, allowed these to be delivered without any postage due. They gave them tolerance to let them go through. It took quite a long time to arrive. That left in July 1942, arrived in Paris on the 29th of August. 7 weeks, goes by Marseille, Foreign Office in Marseille. But they did get through. But the French Post Office quite kindly let them go without any extra postage. A very small number of letters were allowed to go between the two zones, usually companies that were under German control. I'm not quite sure how that one worked out, but again, um, it went through the Chamber of Commerce probably. And again, although it's coming from Toulouse, it's not been cancelled until it got to Paris. Allowed to go through the two zones. So there we are, just a little bit on